Hi, Miss McQueen students. This is Mrs. Walker. I am back and I'm going to be reading you this article for our assignment today. It's called Sleepy Teenage Brains Need School Start Later in the Morning. And so I'm going to go through it and explain my annotations, and then you need to make sure that you complete that tree map on your slides. And I will show that to you in the main video, but make sure that you complete that tree map based on what you find the arguments, the claims, evidence, and reasoning. And I'm going to talk through it. Remember, you can argue whether you think something is evidence or reasoning, and sometimes they can go together. So let's just keep that in mind as we read. I'm going to start off with the title, Sleepy Teenage Brains Need School to Start Later in the Morning. This title already lets me know that the author, Kyla Wallstrom, is going to argue that schools need to start later in the morning. So I'm going to say that's our main argument. Okay, let's begin now. Millions of high schoolers are fighting with their alarm clocks as they start another academic year. Okay, already she's telling us that high schoolers are fighting with their alarm clocks as they start another year. That's a claim because that's going to her argument. She's going to argue that they're fighting their alarm clocks. So let's see how she backs this up and explains this claim, her reasoning. As they struggle to get up early, parents battle to get them out of bed and off to school, a stressful way for everyone involved to start the day. Are teenagers just being lazy when they have to be dragged out of bed in the morning? According to the National Sleep Foundation, the sleep requirements for teenagers is 8 to 10 hours per night, yet the average teen in America obtains less than 7 hours of sleep on a school night. A big part of the reason why is that nearly half of all high schools in the U.S. start before 8 a.m., and over 85% are starting before 8:30 a.m. So already she cites a foundation and gives us some statistics that teenagers need 8 to 10 hours of sleep, and they're not getting that. They're getting less than 7 hours of sleep. And then she tells us a reason why is that nearly half of all high schools in America start before 8 a.m. So this is connecting and explaining, okay, why are students fighting their alarm clocks? Well, evidence is that they need sleep and they're not getting enough sleep. My reasoning why they aren't getting enough sleep is because high schools in the U.S. are starting before 8 a.m. Let's keep going. Sleep deprivation in teenagers as a result of early school hours has been a topic of concern and debate for over 2 decades. Districts across the country have wrestled with the question of whether their local high school should start later. I've been studying the effect of later high school start times for 20 years. My research shows that teens' inability to get out of bed before 8 a.m. has serious consequences for learning and health outcomes. Essentially, the adolescent inability to be fully awake before then is a matter of human biology, not a matter of attitude. Okay, so I'm gonna say right here that this is another claim, and she's gonna be backing this claim up throughout the article. And so we're just going to keep that in mind. Okay, got to get to class. In the earliest days of American education, students of all ages attended a single school with a single starting time. In fact, as late as 1910, half of all children attended one-room schools. As schools and districts grew in size in the early 1930s, staggered starting times became increasingly common. The oldest students in cities and large towns were given the earliest starting time, with the thought that high school was preparation for the adult world of work. Many rural schools continue to have a single starting time as buses pick up students of all ages on a single run. So right here, she's giving us some historical background, but this isn't necessarily, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily evidence for this claim. So let's just keep on going to see if she gives us another claim and evidence to back that up or reasoning to explain that. Since 2014, however, major national health organizations have taken a policy stand to support the implementation of later starting times for high school. Okay, so we know now that major national health organizations have taken a policy stand to support implementation of later for high school. Okay, so this looks like it is actually all evidence for this claim. So it's not just an attitude problem. We're learning now that major health organizations are talking about that this is a health issue. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and most recently, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine have all come out with statements that recommend high schools start at 8:30 a.m. or later. A national conference held in April 2017 showcased the research linking teen sleep, later high school start times, and significant positive academic health and safety outcomes. Okay, so right here, our author is giving us a lot of evidence to support that claim that this is actually a health issue and that health organizations are taking a stand. Since the experts have started to weigh in, hundreds of schools in 45 states across the country have been able to make a shift. So right here, she's giving this information to tell us, okay, this is why I'm giving you this evidence. It's because experts are weighing in and schools are paying attention and shifting their start time. So I am going to label this by italicizing it as reasoning, because this is making that connection between her claim and her evidence. So that way we understand why she's giving us this evidence to support her claim. In fact, the state of California is currently considering a bill that would require all middle and high schools in the state to start school no earlier than 8:30 a.m. by the year 2020. Again, this is evidence to support that claim that schools need to start later because it's a matter of health rather than an attitude with teenagers. Legislators are starting to consider teen sleep deficit as an issue of public health. And so this is here, she's saying, okay, here's my evidence, and I'm explaining why I gave that evidence is because legislators are now considering it. That in legislators means lawmakers. Okay, why does it matter if teens are tired? Studies on sleep in general and sleep in teens in particular have revealed the serious negative consequences of lack of adequate sleep. Teens who are sleep deprived, defined as obtaining less than 8 hours of sleep per night, are significantly more likely to use cigarettes, drugs, and alcohol. So let's look at this. Studies on sleep in teens in particular have revealed that so she's saying that there are negative consequences of lack of adequate sleep. That's her claim. And then teens who are sleep deprived are significantly more likely to use cigarettes, drugs, and alcohol. So while she is bringing in evidence, I'm going to still put that says just the claim, because this is what she's going to be arguing. Why does it matter if teens are tired? She's going to be saying it has negative, serious consequences, and that they're going to get into troubling behavior if you don't get enough sleep. So let's see how she supports this with evidence and explains those supports. The incidence of depression among teens significantly rises with less than 9 hours of sleep. Around half of teens who sleep 4 hours or less per night feel sad and hopeless, compared to just 19% of well-rested peers. Teen car crashes, the primary cause of death for teenagers, significantly decline when teens obtain more than 8 hours of sleep per night. Okay, so right here she's giving us a lot of statistics on incidents of depression among teens who don't get enough sleep, and then teen car crash rates. One thing that I want you to look at is, how do we know where she's getting this information from? That's one thing. That's why we always say cite your evidence. And so that's just one thing I want to keep in mind is when you're looking through an argument, make sure that the person who's writing the article is citing their evidence. I know that this lady is a researcher, so this could be just her research, but she doesn't say that. So that's just something I want to keep in mind. A newly released report by the RAND Corporation quantified the cost to our society of early high school start times in terms of low income due to impaired academic and professional performance and car crashes for teens who are sleep deprived. The report projected annual gains to the U.S. economy of nearly $9.4 billion over 15 years of high school starts nationwide at 8:30 a.m. Okay, so she's bringing in evidence to support the claim that teens will have health problems. But I'm also going to say that maybe this is a reasoning because she's explaining why does this matter? Okay, it matters because if teens are feeling hopeless, her evidence, then we're going to lose money in the economy because students are going to be reaching their full potential. So even though that this is a cited source, I'm going to say that it's also reasoning because she's making it clear why does this evidence matter in supporting her claim. Okay, let's keep going. So what exactly is going on with teenagers and their sleep patterns? Can't they just go to bed earlier? Research informing expert recommendations began in the 1980s with studies that cast new light on what goes on in the teenage brain. Okay, so is there a claim in here? So now she's asking questions. What is going on with teen sleep patterns? Can't they just go to bed earlier? I'm going to say that this is a claim, even though it's a question, because she's basically supporting that main argument by saying there's something going on with teenage brains and why can't they just go to bed earlier? This is called a rhetorical question, and it's when she knows the answer to it, but she's going to state it as a question so she gets you engaged as a reader. Research informing expert recommendations began in the 1980s with studies that cast new light on what goes on in the teenage brain. Our brain releases the sleep hormone melatonin as a signal that allows us to fall and stay asleep. In preteens and adults, secretion of melatonin is flexible and variable, and sleep timing preferences are genetically based, but the timing is different in teens as it is related to puberty. For virtually all adolescents, the secretion of melatonin doesn't begin until about 10:45 p.m. and continues until about 8 a.m. This means that most teenagers are unable to fall asleep until melatonin secretion begins, and it's hard to wake back up until the melatonin secretion stops. This fixed pattern of melatonin secretion in teens changes back to the individual's genetically preferred sleep-waking time once puberty is over. All right. So I've underlined this because on the surface, it looks like, oh, she's giving us scientific information. So up here, our brains release the sleep hormone melatonin as a signal to fall asleep. So this is evidence to support that, hey, we can't just go to bed earlier. In preteens and adults, it's flexible, but in teens, it's related to our changes as we're growing up. So I'm going to say that's her evidence to support the claim. But this next paragraph, to me, it seems like she's explaining why that matters. So I'm going to change this to reasoning because she's explaining why that matters, why the sleep hormone is important in our development. Especially, I love that she writes this means because that's a clear indicator that she's explaining her reasoning. So remember that when you are writing your own arguments is that be explicit to explain your reasoning. So say this means. Okay, let's keep going. The unique sleep-wake pattern of teens is beyond their control. Just expecting teens to minimize distractions and go to bed earlier is not a solution. This kind of seems like a claim that she's making. I'm going to change that to right there. Just expecting teens. So she's saying that we can't just expect teens to go to bed earlier. This is part of their biology. Now let's see how she supports that. I have interviewed hundreds of teens who all said that if they went to bed earlier, they were unable to fall asleep. They just stared at the ceiling until sleep set in around 11 p.m. And so I'm going to change this to evidence because she's saying I'm a researcher and I interviewed students and they were unable to fall asleep. They just stared at the ceiling until 11 p.m. Researchers around the world corroborated, that means they all agreed upon these findings. At the onset of puberty, nearly all humans and most mammals experience a delay of sleep timing in the brain. Medical researchers have also found that sleep patterns of younger children enable them to rise early and be ready for learning much earlier than adolescents. In other words, the biology of the teenage brain is in direct conflict with school schedules, which typically require adolescents to begin school earlier and younger children to start later. Okay, so what I've highlighted right here, I'm going to argue is her reasoning, because she's saying, hey, this evidence is true because researchers have also agreed, and also nearly all humans, most mammals, during their teenage years experience a delay of sleep timing in the brain. And then she's also clarifying that evidence over here by saying, in other words, the biology of the teenage brain is in direct conflict with school schedules. So she's just clarifying that main argument that schools need to start later, and we can't just expect teens to minimize distractions and go to bed earlier. All right. So I really want you to think about reasoning is explaining those connections between the claims and the evidence. We're almost done. Let's keep going. What happens with a later start? Results from schools that switch to a later time are encouraging. The students do in fact get more sleep, tending to go to bed at the same time but getting to rise a bit later in the morning. Not only does the teens' use of drugs, cigarettes, and alcohol decline, their academic performance improves significantly with the later start time. So right here, I've made that our main claim in this paragraph is results from schools that switch to a later start time are encouraging. More recently, car crash rates for teens have declined with the implementation of later high school start time. In fact, the crash rate for teens in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2013 dropped by 70% in the first year the district adopted a later high school start. Okay, so right here, she's saying that switching from an early start time to a late start time has been encouraging. She's bringing in, I would actually say that this is supporting that claim. The students do in fact get more sleep, and they tend to go to bed at the same time. And I would also say this is not reasoning. This is evidence, because she is providing more evidence of that study. Okay. And then to further elaborate on that, she's going to give more evidence. More recently, car crash rates for teen drivers have declined with the implementation of later high school start times. In fact, the crash rates for teens in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in 2013 dropped by 70% the first year the district adopted a later school start. Plenty of schools and districts across the U.S. are resisting delaying the starting time of their high schools for many reasons. Issues such as changing transportation routes and altering the timing for other grade levels often head the list of factors, making the later start difficult. Schools must also consider the effects on after-school sports and activities. Such concerns are valid, however, schools that have delayed start times have found creative solutions. For example, schools adopted mixed-age busing, coordinated with public transport systems, and expanded after-school childcare. There's clearly more that needs to be addressed in making the change. But in the end, communities that value maximum development for all of its children should be willing to grapple with solutions. After all, our children's ability to move into healthy adult lives tomorrow depends on what we as adults are deciding for them today. Okay, so I want to review. Most of the time, evidence is going to be clearly explicit, and sometimes the reasoning is not going to be that clear, because sometimes authors just want you to connect the dots. What we've seen in this article is that sometimes this author connects the dots for us. And a lot of times that happens when she says this means, or for example, so we can kind of understand that reasoning more explicitly, but sometimes we have to just connect the dots for ourselves. So that's something that I want to keep in mind as you're creating your tree map, but feel free to go along and review
what I've talked about in this video. If you have any questions, message me on Remind or email me at cam0041@uh.edu. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing you. Good luck in quarantine. Bye, you guys.